If someone asked you to name the most important invention in human history, you'd probably think of the wheel, electricity, or maybe the internet. Very few people would point to a potato. It doesn't look remarkable. It isn't rare. It isn't expensive. Today, it's something we bake, mash, fry, or forget at the bottom of the pantry until it begins to sprout. Yet this ordinary root quietly changed the course of civilizations. It fueled the rise of empires, fed armies during war, transformed the economies of entire continents, and eventually became responsible for one of the deadliest humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. Millions of people lived because of it. Millions of others died because they depended on it too much. But none of that was inevitable. Long before it filled supermarket shelves or became the world's favorite side dish, the potato was something entirely different. It was poisonous. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, where the air is thin enough to leave visitors breathless and snow can blanket the ground overnight, wild potatoes grew scattered across rocky slopes nearly 8,000 years ago. The landscape was harsh. Farming at these elevations demanded patience, resilience, and generations of accumulated knowledge. The plants themselves offered little encouragement. Their tubers were tiny, bitter, and packed with toxic compounds that could make anyone violently ill. Eating them raw often meant severe stomach pain, vomiting, and in larger quantities, death. By any reasonable standard, they looked like one of the last foods worth cultivating. Yet the people who lived among these mountains saw something others would have ignored. Over countless generations, they experimented. They noticed that soaking the tubers in cold mountain streams reduced some of their bitterness. They discovered that leaving them outside during freezing nights and warm days slowly neutralized many of the remaining toxins. It wasn't chemistry as we understand it today, but it was careful observation, repeated trial and error, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Every successful harvest taught another lesson. The least bitter potatoes were replanted, the most productive plants were saved. Year after year, century after century, people unknowingly practiced selective breeding, slowly transforming a dangerous wild plant into something dependable. It was one of humanity's earliest agricultural triumphs. Without laboratories, genetics, or written records, these early farmers accomplished what modern scientists would later recognize as thousands of years of deliberate crop improvement. Eventually, the potato became more than just edible. It became extraordinary. By the time the Inca civilization emerged as the dominant power across western South America during the 15th century, potatoes had evolved into an astonishing range of varieties. Thousands existed across the empire. Some were yellow, others were deep purple, bright red, blue, or nearly black. Some were perfectly round, others twisted into bizarre shapes that would never survive today's supermarket quality standards. Every variety served a purpose. Certain potatoes flourished in colder valleys. Others tolerated rocky soils or wetter mountain terraces. Farmers understood exactly which type belonged in which environment, creating an agricultural system perfectly adapted to one of the world's most challenging landscapes. The potato wasn't simply another crop. It was the foundation of the Inca civilization. Across the Andes, engineers carved enormous terraces into mountainsides, creating fertile farmland where none should have existed. Water flowed through sophisticated irrigation systems. Communities shared planting schedules based on elevation, climate, and seasonal conditions. Food production became remarkably reliable. That reliability allowed cities to grow. It allowed governments to expand. It allowed armies to march farther than ever before. But perhaps the Inca's greatest innovation wasn't growing potatoes, it was preserving them. Fresh potatoes spoil quickly. In a world without refrigeration, that creates an enormous problem. A successful harvest means little if most of it rots before winter arrives. The Incas solved that challenge with an ingenious process known today as Chuño. After harvest, potatoes were spread across the freezing ground during cold Andean nights. They froze solid. When the sun returned each morning, families walked barefoot across the frozen tubers, squeezing out moisture while the warmth slowly thawed them. The cycle repeated again and again until almost all the water had been removed. What remained looked nothing like a fresh potato. It became light, hard, dry, almost weightless. Most importantly, it could last for years, not weeks, not months, years. Entire storehouses filled with Chuño became strategic reserves against drought, crop failures, and military campaigns. Soldiers carried it across mountains. Travelers packed it on long journeys. Communities survived difficult seasons because they had transformed one of nature's most perishable foods into one of history's longest-lasting staples. It was food engineering thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. The potato gave the Inca Empire something every civilization desperately needs: security. When harvests failed elsewhere, stored potatoes kept communities alive. When armies traveled, preserved potatoes kept them fed. When populations grew, the land could support them. Food is power, and for centuries, few societies understood that better than the Inca. Ironically, the people who eventually carried potatoes to the rest of the world barely noticed their importance. In the early 15th century, Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America searching for one thing above all else: gold, silver, treasure beyond imagination. They found exactly that. Ship after ship returned to Europe loaded with precious metals stripped from the conquered empire. Fortunes crossed the Atlantic. Yet, among all the riches Spain encountered, one of history's greatest treasures attracted almost no attention: the potato. To Spanish soldiers, it was simply the food eaten by conquered people. There were no grand celebrations announcing its arrival, no grand ceremonies introducing it to European agriculture, no wealthy merchants rushing to trade it. Instead, potatoes quietly appeared on ships as cheap provisions for sailors or as food supplied to hospitals, monasteries, and the poor. Spain had unknowingly transported a crop that would eventually feed billions. Almost nobody cared. And when the potato slowly spread beyond Spain into the rest of Europe, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was fear. To understand why, you have to see Europe through the eyes of someone living 400 years ago. Bread wasn't merely food, it represented civilization itself. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats dominated European farming. They grew above the soil, reaching towards the heavens. Grain held deep religious significance. Bread appeared throughout Christian tradition, reinforcing the belief that these crops were part of God's natural order. The potato seemed to belong to the opposite world. It grew underground, hidden in darkness, dirty, misshapen, covered with strange eyes. Even worse, botanists recognized it as a relative of deadly nightshade, one of Europe's most poisonous plants. For many people, that association settled the question immediately. If it resembled poisonous plants, if it grew beneath the earth, if Scripture never mentioned it, perhaps it wasn't meant for humans at all. Rumors spread much faster than facts. Some claimed potatoes caused disease. Others insisted they produced madness. In several regions, they were blamed for everything from skin disorders to moral decay. Few accusations required evidence. Fear rarely does. For nearly 2 centuries, Europe largely rejected one of the greatest food sources humanity had ever discovered. The consequences of that decision would reshape history. For generations, the potato occupied an unusual place in Europe. People admired its flowers. They debated its medicinal value. They studied it in botanical gardens, but they refused to put it on their dinner tables. To the wealthy, it was an exotic curiosity brought from the New World. To the poor, it was considered animal feed. Respectable families would rather eat stale bread than admit they relied on potatoes. Even during difficult harvests, many communities viewed the crop as a last resort, something to be consumed only when every other option had failed. It was a remarkable contradiction. Europe regularly suffered food shortages. Crop failures were common. Winters could be brutal. Yet one of the most productive food plants ever discovered sat almost untouched in gardens across the continent. Then history intervened. War has a way of changing opinions faster than philosophy ever can. In the 18th century, the Kingdom of Prussia was becoming one of Europe's dominant military powers. But constant warfare brought a familiar problem. Enemy armies didn't just fight soldiers, they targeted food supplies. Burn the wheat fields, destroy the grain stores, starve the population. It was a strategy as old as civilization itself. Grain fields were easy targets. A single torch could wipe out months of work. But potatoes were different. Hidden beneath the soil, they remained invisible even when armies marched directly across them. An invading force could destroy barns, seize livestock, and burn villages without realizing thousands of meals were still waiting underground. King Frederick II, better known as Frederick the Great, recognized the military advantage immediately. If his people relied more heavily on potatoes, Prussia would become much harder to starve into submission. There was only one problem. His people hated potatoes. Royal orders encouraging farmers to plant them achieved almost nothing. Many villagers ignored the commands completely, convinced that the strange underground vegetable was unhealthy or simply disgusting. Frederick needed another strategy. According to one of history's most famous agricultural legends, he decided to manipulate human nature instead of fighting it. He planted a royal potato field near Berlin. Then he stationed armed guards around it. The message required no explanation. Anything guarded by soldiers must be valuable. Curiosity spread quickly. Why would the king protect these ordinary plants so carefully? Before long, local farmers began sneaking into the fields after dark to steal potatoes for themselves, exactly as Frederick hoped. Whether every detail of the story is historically accurate remains debated by historians, but the outcome is undeniable. Within a generation, potatoes had become a staple throughout much of Prussia. The crop that peasants once mocked was now helping feed an expanding kingdom. Across the border, another unlikely champion was fighting the same battle. His name was Antoine-Augustin Parmentier. Unlike Frederick, Parmentier wasn't a king. He was a pharmacist. His conversion to the potato came under far less glamorous circumstances. During the 7 Years' War, Parmentier was captured by Prussian forces and spent years as a prisoner of war. His daily meals consisted largely of potatoes. According to everything he'd been taught in France, that should have been terrible news. Instead, something unexpected happened. He survived. Not only that, he remained remarkably healthy. The experience forced him to question one of Europe's most persistent myths. If potatoes truly caused disease, why were the people eating them perfectly healthy? When he finally returned to France, Parmentier became obsessed. He wasn't interested in gold. He wasn't chasing political power. He had one mission: convince France that potatoes belonged on the dinner table. It wasn't easy. Facts alone rarely change deeply rooted beliefs. So Parmentier turned to something far more powerful: marketing. He organized lavish dinners where every course featured potatoes: soups, bread, roasted dishes, even desserts. Guests arrived expecting novelty. They left surprised that the mysterious vegetable tasted remarkably good. He presented potato blossoms to King Louis XVI. The king reportedly placed one in his buttonhole. Queen Marie Antoinette wore the flowers in her hair, transforming an ignored plant into an unexpected fashion statement. Suddenly, potatoes carried royal approval. Yet Parmentier wasn't satisfied still. He borrowed a page from Frederick's playbook. Outside Paris, he planted a large potato field and hired guards to patrol it during the day. The field appeared priceless. Every evening, however, the guards quietly disappeared. Predictably, curious locals slipped inside and stole the plants. People often desire what they believe they aren't supposed to have. Parmentier understood that instinct centuries before modern advertising agencies built billion-dollar industries around it. By the end of the 18th century, attitudes had begun to shift. French farmers planted more potatoes. Families started eating them regularly. What had once symbolized poverty gradually became practical. The potato had finally found a place in European agriculture. But nowhere would its impact become greater than across the Irish Sea. Ireland's relationship with the potato would become one of the extraordinary and ultimately heartbreaking stories in agricultural history. By the early 1700s, much of Ireland existed under British control. Most of the land belonged to wealthy Protestant landlords. Many never even lived there. Instead, they collected rent while Irish Catholic tenant farmers worked small plots they could lose at almost any moment. Generations of political restrictions left many families with little choice. As land passed from parent to child, farms became smaller and smaller. Some households survived on only 2 or 3 acres. Growing enough grain on such tiny plots was almost impossible. But the potato changed everything. An acre of potatoes could produce far more food than an acre of wheat or barley. The crop tolerated poor soil. It thrived in Ireland's cool, wet climate. It required little equipment beyond simple hand tools. Most importantly, it produced enough calories to sustain entire families. Combined with milk or buttermilk, potatoes supplied surprisingly balanced nutrition. For countless households, survival no longer depended on owning large farms. A few acres were enough. The results were dramatic. Ireland's population surged, villages expanded, families grew, communities flourished. What had once been a struggling agricultural society became one of Europe's fastest-growing populations. The potato wasn't merely improving lives, it was making them possible.